right, well, welcome everybody to this week's governance workshop. We are going to try a couple of new things today, given that it's summer and things are a little quiet, so we thought it would be a good opportunity to try a different approach. But as usual, we'll start with a review of things that are currently in process. So we currently have 4 Treasury proposals, an unusually large amount, 4 that are active on the forum. Well, actually 3 that are active on the forum, 1 that is currently in voting. So thanks to everyone who's voted. And if you haven't voted, please come join us on Snapshot. That voting will be active for almost exactly 2 more days, so till 3 o'clock on Friday. And the other 3 proposals we've discussed several previous times, but unless anybody has any questions about those, we'll move on to the next piece. Any open issues? Yeah, I figured we've talked quite a bit about those. So for the next bit, in terms of talking about the process, we're thinking that the last couple times we've talked about process, it might have been a little sort of abstract in terms of how the process actually works and what the consequences of some of these decisions might be. So we thought it might be interesting, and I thank Tommy for the suggestion, to, where am I going here? To work on making it a little more tangible. So what I'm putting up here, if you've seen the Google Doc that went out, great. This is the exact same thing, just putting it in a Miro board so people can see. So what we thought we'd try and do today is walk through, setting up a specific scenario. So what if a specific vote were to happen, and then we can talk about how we might get out of reconciliation in this very specific corner case. And I know this all seems pretty abstract, but or not pretty abstract. It's probably going to be a pretty unlikely occurrence, but as we'll see, reconciliation is a place where the SOFONs and potentially the community can be overruled. So it's a really important case to think about, right? So if we look at the case that's here on the screen, we've got a setup where we've got an integration in this scenario that went through, was proposed, that required, integration effort as well as an allocation of 7,000 Rook. The proposal went through the community. It had community consensus. There weren't any serious objections raised on the forum. And then in this scenario, the proposal went to the SOFONs. And the SOFONs objected. And the reason, by the way, that's in here is because this is something that can happen in our process. It hasn't happened to date, but it can happen that the SOFONs would object to something that the community had consensus around. So the case goes on, the SOFONs in this case object. They publish their objection, and then it goes to a vote. And in the vote in this scenario, we can imagine that there were 15,000 Rook and Rook equivalents voted, and the results were split half and half. So in this scenario, half the votes were to object, so in line with the SOFONs, and half of the votes were no objection. At that point in this case, the vote went to reconciliation. So just a quick reminder, reconciliation is what happens in our process when the SOFONs and the token holders can't reach agreement or don't reach agreement through the vote. So the vote is not aligned with the SOFONs, as it was in this case. However, in this case, they were unable to reach social consensus, they were unable to reach soft consensus with the SOFONs. So normally, in a normally functioning reconciliation, the SOFONs and the objectors work toward a meeting of the minds, and the process moves forward that way. But you can imagine there will be cases where that's not possible, and that's what we're talking about today. So this is the setup that we have for this case. Does anybody have any questions? All right, then let's move on to some different scenarios. So we can imagine a few different scenarios that might happen in terms of how we might get out of this. So the first one would be that the SOFONs would decide. This is sort of unofficially where we are now in terms of how we get out of this kind of scenario. Although to date, again, it's not been an issue in that the SOFONs have been able to reach soft consensus. So that's scenario 1. What I thought we would do is, rather than reading through all these at once, we would go through scenario by scenario and sort of break them down. So in each scenario, if this is the solution, what does it help? And also, how does it break? How might it not work? And open questions that we might have. So does anybody want to take on this Sophons one?
Yeah, I can start it off. I think this gives the Sophons a lot of power, because basically what they can do is they'll have like their own anonymous wallets, and they object vote. Then it goes into reconciliation, and then they can decide on it, right?
Yep. So you're saying it gives them too much power?
Yeah, because depending on how fast it goes to reconciliation, like if they all have substantial amount of Rook, they can kind of push it to reconciliation, during which they can decide on it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And that can be especially problematic based on like how the election works for Sophons, right?
Yeah. Exactly. All right. What does it help? Are there any benefits to this approach?
I mean, I think that in terms of contrasting it to kind of what we kind of see now, or kind of having no solution, what helps is that it makes it very clear what's going to happen when we see this scenario.
Yeah.
I think that it also it really makes sure that the DAO needs to make sure that the right people are Sophons as well. But that's probably more of on the questions or break side.
Yep. Absolutely.
So
just to kind of chime in with Dietz, it does give a lot of clarity, and if anything, it would help. At least this example would force the authors to kind of almost work with the Sophons' reasoning and kind of work out what to do in order to get past that barrier. But again, like Tommy said, this does give them the final say authority, which it could be too much power, especially if or I guess when some Sophons are offboarded, the new ones coming in, you kind of have to do extra due diligence and to make sure they're not bad actors.
The interesting thing I find there is the Sophons don't have the power to introduce necessarily. They only have the power to remove, which means that their corrupted strategy is essentially one of obstructionism. And understanding when a Sophon is practicing in bad faith in an obstructionist tactic, I think, versus being in a mode of saying no for the best interests of the protocol, being able to determine between those two sort of motivations would create a much more solid framework. But that gets into subjectivity because you're talking about determining motive.
Right.
Jason, in this, was there unanimous Sophon consent or Sophon whatever that they all decided that this was a object?
So that's a good. I mean, in this scenario, it was just they reached consensus on object.
They reached consensus on object. Okay. Go ahead, Aya.
No. I know this is exploring edge cases, but my brain is stuck at in a split vote.
Yeah.
Why is there even a question? That's a lose, right? I mean, you could change it by like adding one and subtracting one from the vote, but that's where my brain's been stuck. Like, wait, why are Sophons involved in this at all the way the example's defined? I'm confused.
Yeah, our voting is a little confusing that way because we call it objection voting, but in reality it's objection to the Sophons recommendation. Because to date everything that's gone to a vote has been supported by the Sophons, and it hasn't gone to a vote unless the Sophons have approved of it in one form or another. But it is possible that we could get something that wasn't necessarily against the mission of the DAO, but that the Sophons nonetheless objected to. So I'm really glad you asked that, because
Do the Sophons have power to introduce a snapshot? Or to whom does that power rest?
that at the moment is, so in the framework we're thinking of, there's going to be a separate group of stewards who are not the Sophons and who are just responsible for the process itself.
Wouldn't that be impossible to police though? Because wallets are pseudo anonymous, right? I mean,
Wait, what would to police what?
for saying that Sophons can't introduce votes, how would you possibly police it? I mean, proposals.
Well, that's what he's saying, is that the people that get to put things up to a vote are independent stewards that are not Sophons.
Yeah, I mean, you control that by controlling who can post something to Snapshot. So our Snapshot's not completely open to all authors.
Okay.
But if you mean a proposal, they absolutely can author a proposal, but they have to, the proposals have names on them.
But so the proposals have some kind of because my point is we're in a pseudonymous space, right?
Yep.
Somebody's easily two different names in a Discord server and online.
Right.
So that's all I'm pointing out. Like, I'm not sure how you'd actually police that unless you go to proof of humanity.
Yeah, no, it's a good point about. So you're saying at the initial stage, before we even get to this voting part, we should be thinking about validating who is making a proposal?
If you're trying to set it up so that Sophons can't propose, yes.
Yeah, no, we're not. We don't want them to propose anonymously, but they should be able to.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's a good question. I mean, I hadn't thought about it much, but I think we've had proposals to date that have been co-authored, and the Sophons recuse themselves from the voting. But that is a really good point, and let's come back to that. All right, cool. Well, let's go on to the next one. This one comes out. We were thinking. So we had a meeting earlier this week with Claros, and we put the notes for that. I forget where they are. They're somewhere, I think, in announcements or updates or in the governance channel. Let me know if you haven't seen them, and they're there. But the idea here, the reason we talked to them was that we were thinking about this question of who's going to moderate between the Sophons and the token holders in reconciliation. And so there's a possibility that we might go to a sort of DAO to DAO service like XYZ protocol here, where we would use their court system. And at least the one we've looked at this week has a court system where it's based on staking that protocol's tokens to become a juror. And then jurors are selected for specific courts based on their specific expertise, as I believe it. As I believe it works. And then they're given a set of decision parameters. So in this case, it might be a mission statement. It might be the Sophon decision parameters. We haven't gotten that far yet, but and full access to all the evidence they would need to make a decision. So in this case, this would be the proposal, records of relevant discussions on the forum, and so on. And so in this case, we can imagine that the arbiters would work through this and come up with a verdict. They're paid kind of as people are paid in prediction markets, so they're paid in stake according to voting with the agreement of their peers. And in this particular case, the court decides in favor of the Sophons and the proposal is not adopted. So who was on? Wes, I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Yeah.
What do you think is? Yeah, go ahead. Where do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I was just going to start with like the benefits and drawbacks of that. Ideally, they're kind of an objective party. They'll have access to like external experts or just kind of more neutral eyes, just people not really affiliated with the DAO. But then some kind of drawbacks that we'd run into is that since they're anonymous, we don't really know the level of knowledge that they have about DAO. There's kind of that when you're introducing tokens, that kind of opens it up to attack vectors of like a Sybil attack, for example. And because people are penalized if they don't go with the majority, I could see situations where the judges are kind of just siding with whatever is the leading side at the time they're kind of voting. So that's kind of what I had here. What does everyone else think?
The jury selection mechanism being based off of stake selects for those with capital, not necessarily those with the best skills for judgment.
Yeah.
Yep. I totally agree with that. And there was actually an example of a Sybil attack on the Claros courts where, I mean, you can tell it's a developer from Claros who had a conflict of interest and kind of rejected a I think it was an insurance claim despite it being valid. Now, ultimately, it did go through, but there was that first arbitration phase where it was kind of stuck in almost their version of reconciliation. So, yeah, you're absolutely right, Joe.
Does anybody have any knowledge of other protocols actually using these? I'm just curious.
I'm not sure. Let me find out.
There have to be, right? Like they're around, but
Yeah, on their homepage they kind of advertise 12 other projects: Uniswap, Gnosis, API 3. Let me do some quick digging over here.
I'd love to know what types of disputes they're actually arbitrating, because like the insurance dispute, something like that makes a lot of sense to me. Just proposals. I don't know. Other than, blatantly ignoring people and the vote, it seems hard to do.
Would you have different external parties for different types of issues? Like you'd have somebody that arbitrates on financial issues, somebody that arbitrates on smart contract issues, and somebody that arbitrates on personnel decisions.
Yeah, we didn't get so we only had half an hour with the person from Claros, and it was the first.
So they did mention that, like, for the type of stuff that we're doing, they're like, oh, I think that would be our whatever court. So it does sound like they've got, they're at least trying to select for people who know what they're talking about in certain areas. But I don't know exactly how it worked, but it did sound like they've got some sort of delineation.
Yeah. They have different kinds of courts, although it's a little unclear how many there are, but yeah, different kinds of courts for whether they're technical versus non-technical. Clearly they have this insurance piece, and then people, as I understand, and this is just Claros, we haven't talked to any other ones, but people stake to participate in a court, and then as they participate in the court and they amass rewards for making decisions that are, quote, correct, end quote, their stake grows, and then they're more likely to be selected. But yeah, this question of types of disputes is a huge one.
My thought about this is that somebody would, in my opinion, at least, and from what I've understood, not everything is like, should we put X amount of dollars to something? They need to be following development here. They need to understand what capabilities are of like they need to have like a very, not just high level, but probably pretty detailed understanding of our protocol, our operations, and our personnel.
Yep.
And so that would, how you police that, or how you check in on that, and how you ensure that you're getting high quality kind of comprehension. I wouldn't be able to define that. And that seems like that would be an extremely heavy investment from us to either create, a specific person that's just sole purpose is coordinating with external parties that make sure that they are in good understanding of things. Like at that point, I don't. I mean, if that's necessary, then that's something the DAO would have to look into, investing in. But I don't know if I'm seeing that the benefits are outweighing the the effort.
Mm-hmm. Great. Anything else on this third party idea? I think that was great.
I'm just gonna affirm others who have kind of said for governance, it
Mhm.
seems weird to be going to outsiders who are less informed
Yep.
to get the decision. It's not something that's like when things are law based, you can go to any arbiter because the law is the law and they know it. It's just the details of the situation. But this isn't really about law. This is about governance and creating the law for the community. So it just seems weird, especially with the cost on top of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
The decision parameters being set by Rook for the arbiters to adhere to,
Mm-hmm.
that could also mean that the problem that creates the deadlock is propagated into the decision the arbiters are forced into.
Yep.
And so it may be a non-solution for some projects.
Having sat in on the Claros meeting, I would echo all these sentiments that these are things that I was worried about as I was listening to that, like these failure modes, the requirement to learn deeply about the protocols process. This was concerning to me as well, and I can't really see a case where someone who is an anonymous juror would be able to learn the intricacies of the process and be able to take that information as part of their decision-making process.
Yep.
And that's huge. Obviously, like a legal expert can spend a lifetime learning bylaws and the ins and outs of their state and local governments and stuff, but asking that of an anonymous juror on a short notice is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, great. Making this one easy. That is good. All right. Well, let's go on to the next one. So in this scenario, instead of the SOFONs deciding, we have kind of the opposite. In this case, the proposal is put back to the community for purely an approval-based vote, where a simple majority decides. So this is not going to just the objectors. This is just going back to the total community after the reconciliation process doesn't work. In this particular case, the turnout for the vote ends up being higher than the initial 15,000, and several anonymous whales who weren't there earlier in the discussion vote with the SOFONs against the proposal. And so the proposal is not adopted. And remember, in this particular case, the community had been pretty strongly in favor of it. And I will, full disclosure, this idea came from Above Average Joe. So Joe, I'm going to ask you to tell us more about what you think is the benefit here and where you think this might break.
Well, it's been a long time since I've set up a truth table properly, but if you were to look at the total number of permutations in the process of a proposal going through the initial phases and then going through the community approval vote, the reversal of direction creates an effect very similar to a diode in functionality. It allows for energy flow one direction but not the other. And if you have a tiebreaker type of event here where the equivalent energies are the same, that can act as a sort of autonomous module. The downsides are obviously in potential for the community to vote against the best interests of the protocol, which the SOFONs would represent honestly in this particular case.
Mm-hmm.
And that would lead to adoption of something that is detrimental to the organization. And in that particular case, yes, you are adhering to the will of the community, but doing so is not in the best good of the protocol.
Right.
That can have varying ranges of effects depending on how far reaching that particular proposal could be.
Yeah.
The SOFONs having a capability to veto tends to be, if used as intended, a way to block things that are against the interests of the protocol from the community. And that's why I've used the reference as a white blood cell before. If you remove the ability of that white blood cell to block the metaphorical cancerous growth,
Mm-hmm.
then the objective for which the entire office was created is rendered moot. But the deadlock scenario is largely going to be a rare one. If the SOFONs are not restricted from making proposals, then it might be the case that no SOFON is going to introduce a proposal that they are then going to oppose. So, assuming that a SOFON has pushed one through in the positive, they're not going to veto their own thing, and there is more chance of risk from that origin vector, which is why I think so many are concerned about it.
Mm-hmm.
And this methodology doesn't really stop that unless the community is opposed to the SOFONs in the positive state,
Mm-hmm.
which voters decide kind of engineers that parameter where they are forced into a positive declaration of opposing.
Yep. Great.
I think leaving this up to that tiebreaker kind of opens us up to I think what Hazard was saying kind of in the beginning, where there's intentionally not a monetary amount placed on the like a proposal that needs to pass to
Mm-hmm.
kind of to limit the effect that these large whales or bad actors can have. If this were implemented right, then it's just whatever 50% of our market cap, which is I'm gonna guess like 15 million. And as we kind of know, these keepers they definitely have 15 million to spare, and then they could kind of push through this. And a quick example would be liquidating the treasury, right? Because
Yep.
we've traded at such below the treasury value for a while. That's kind of whatever first
Mm-hmm.
use case if this was put into place. So just something that I think about and
Yeah. Yeah.
want to make. Yeah.
Yeah. Does that change? Does that calculus change if we enable the SOFONs to provide that white blood cell function earlier in the process? So one of the things we were talking about is
Mm.
allowing the SOFONs to reject proposals at the very early stage, if and only if they run counter to the mission of the protocol.
Yeah. So yeah, that obviously changes things. I think.
Okay.
At least I would hope so. Where all the KPs being voted on are aligned with the mission, so that token vote would there's no kind of bad outcome besides denying it. Yeah, I think that's initially seems like a good solution. What does everyone else think?
I agree completely with it. It easily puts a price tag on a vote, which I think is not a great way of deciding things.
Yeah.
Thinking about kind of the conversation from yesterday about DAOs, and it really makes me think that you've got to think of the the impact that giving this ability to token holders has. And so I think that this in one sense can be a very solid motivator for somebody wanting to hold on to the token, is that they have this final say.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes that token a little bit more sticky. So yeah, I don't want to discount that too much, that that this does give that additional governing power to folks that are holding, and it could be something that you could have a different specific strategy for this scenario too, where you have, say, in the first round of objection voting, you have the strategy that we currently deploy, which is 1 for 1, pretty much, and at this point you could be like, well, people that have been around longest, or I don't know, you set some other specific parameters for this tie-breaking decision that would, let's say, ensure alignment long term with the protocol, or would have a better chance of ensuring alignment with the protocol.
Mm-hmm. Great point. Sorry, this typeface is so tiny.
One thing that is also considerable here is if the methodology in which the token holders decide is utilized in a nefarious manner is relatively limited in its attack surface to something like a treasury liquidation, or perhaps a redistribution of the bid funding or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
core system changes. You could, in your governance documentation, declare specific types of improvement proposals invalid if they hit a tie state. So if they get this far down the pipeline and it's evident that it's because it's an attack vector, and that there's only 1 or 2 targets, you can say if it gets to this stage and it's targeted at this, then the proposal automatically fails because we consider that a potential attack.
Gotcha.
Easy to close floodgates, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I clearly don't fully get Rook governance, because I was rereading and I still don't get why a tie doesn't just fail anyways. Right? So if that's the only real problem this is solving, is because there's equal objections and consent, in my brain that seems like something that doesn't have consent whether SOFONs agree with it or not.
Yeah. No, well, it's not. So this
Yeah.
isn't about the tying of the vote. It's more about the lack of agreement between the SOFONs and the vote.
Jason, I would also want to add that what it looks like it was determined was that there was sufficient objection for it to move to reconciliation.
Exactly.
So at that point, it's, the numbers aren't, it's arbitrary that they were both 7,500 on each side. What we saw was that there was significant effort, both either in terms of number of wallets or in amount of Rook voting for objection, that it would move to reconciliation.
Yeah, exactly. That was more the point.
So, and then in my mind, unless things are broken, you're not gonna fix it or change it, and it's really important to understand points of view. So doing this abstractly, to me, is just hard to really think about. And abstractly, I just go, well, you just create simple rules so you're not worried about the boundary conditions and everybody knows the clarity kind of thing, but without even needing SOFONs involved, which way things are going to go. If it's just about people against SOFONs, then to me, there's the real need for explicit understanding of SOFON point of view and whatever the alternative point of view is. And that last case where, there's a super SOFON group representing ostensibly different point of views for real in the community could show up in those rare cases, right? And I still think there should be a kind of bias against making change, because changes that are valuable for the community in general, you should be able to get consent on, right? If something's really litigious, then, and if people have uh, authentic points of view, then there should be some way to create, I believe there's always a win-win-win kind of perspective if people are actually working together. Now, if somebody is literally just in it for themselves, that goes away. But ideally in community, there's enough alignment that that's really always possible. So I don't know why you would want to add anything where there is such difference of agreement, right? You're basically saying that, some parts of the community totally disagree with other parts of the community, and not only disagree with it, but they feel threatened by it enough to stop them from doing whatever. And so I actually think, although this is a kind of interesting theoretical thing, just coming up with simple rules for specific cases, and then in real life, if it's all of SOFONs, that has a weight on its own initially, and it seems to me like if you're going to allow votes to counter that in some way, you just need some kind of supermajority and have to live with it and be open to the governance attack that's possible, but still have some kind of veto power for anything that any rational person can clearly say, like, hey, this is clearly bad for the DAO. And, hopefully there is a small core group of people that can't be bought, that cares about community enough to veto things that really must be vetoed. I mean, because there's no perfect process. Just, we're too creative in being bad as well as good as human beings. So there is no perfect process. Clarity is good just so that people can understand.
Yeah, I agree. The clarity is very good, but I think the way you get to clarity is thinking about what could go wrong and making sure that we've kind of thought through some possible cases, because there have been decisions made by the community in the past where the clarity wasn't there, and also where that I agree. Ideally, the community would be clear and the expressions of preferences would be clear, but one of the strengths of our process is it doesn't 100% rely on that, because it's not always clear where people stand and what they think. So ideally, we would be able to draw that out. And that is something we're working on, but I think it does benefit us to think of these edge cases, because they will come up sooner or later, right?
Well, right. And that's why I was saying, though, I think simple rules instead of trying to come up with some ideal perfect system makes more sense. So if you have simple heuristics, like if there's this much misalignment in what active community thinks, people voting, then to me that's a reason not to make a change in itself. So defaulting to that with or without SOFONs. And then if it's community against SOFONs or voters against SOFONs, if it's not something that's damaging to community, then some quorum should be able to move the community, irrespective of what SOFONs, who as a small group are much easier to influence or control.
Yeah, I mean, we have been talking about a quorum to tip into reconciliation. But we still need to, I think we definitely still need to think about this. Like, yeah, and I would just repeat, I think you're right. We need some simple rules, but the way to get to simple rules is think about the potential complications, and then we can simplify from there.
Oh, I'm not saying don't do this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm in agreement that clarity and simplicity is good, but the funny thing about this kind of exercise is our process is really built around deliberation. And so voting is not meant to be how we make decisions. It's meant to, in our framework, it's meant to sort of gather a final stage opinion on ratification of what the community and the SOFONs have arrived at. So this is, you're right to the extent that this is a somewhat artificial case because this should be exceedingly rare. But nonetheless, we do have to think about it. So you raised the issue of the super SOFONs. I don't know what else to call them, but the idea here is that we've got a separate group that is convened in this I mean, maybe we would convene them for other things, but in this context, in this thought experiment, they'd be a group that sits above the SOFONs. It may include some SOFONs, it may not, but it's meant to be representative of the larger community, people from labs and experts. We can, we're way ahead of getting into the weeds on what the composition is, but the idea is there's some group that lives outside of the SOFONs and these specific token holders that is able to adjudicate this. And they are knowledgeable in the way that the external arbiters would not be. So in our last minutes, what do people think about this one?
Well, I definitely think it helps with trust in terms of, presumably these would be people that have some real knowledge of what's going on in the community and protocol.
Yep.
I would probably say that this group would have more strict qualifications or I guess kind of boundaries on who could be designated as this. That would be my thought, is if this group established another layer of trust, that would probably be one of the only ways I could see this happening. I would like to think that this breaks when somebody would breach that trust. I think that there's never 100% certainty that this person is acting in the way that they're speaking. So I think that there's always that you're building in trust still, and so that's where I would think that the only way I could ever see something like this happening is if you had built in a way to gain that trust in a very kind of actionable manner. So I mean, I would have a lot to say about how this position gets formed and who qualifies for it, but I don't think we're at that part of this exercise.
Yeah.
And you want to talk about contentious vote bribery and buying the treasury? How about I only have to buy these people? That might be a whole lot cheaper.
Well,
I mean,
you have to get to these extraordinary circumstances first, right?
Potentially.
So
if you're the one creating the circumstances, then you can plan ahead.
It's funny.
Well, that's
I've
why
heard
I
this
was liking
discussion.
The simple rules.
I've heard this discussion before where you get the bribe economy right now with Convex and other folks that use, kind of incentivized voting systems. And okay, well, how much does it cost to bribe to get my outcome? And the true answer is, wouldn't it be so much cheaper to just bribe the devs? And so this is where I would see that situation being very similar, that you now have a much smaller pool of people to target. So yeah, I think that could be one area of challenge here.
They also may not be directly available for coordination with the rarity of their activation expectations. So, they spend 3 months not doing anything about it, and then one day they get the call, but because it's 3 months later, they've moved on and forgotten about it. And so you wind up with people who don't take the responsibility when the time comes.
Yeah, absolutely.
At the surface layer, the power of the super sophons would probably mimic the decision-making capacity of the token holders because of the community election process, though.
Mm.
That's a good point. That it is a broader reflection of the community. You could say that in one sense for the sophons and now the super sophons as well, in a strictly kind of elected based process.
If they were elected, yeah. I think an implementation issue here, which if we want to get really specific about it, there's already a limited pool of people that we would elect as sophons, and we need to do that first. So the thought of recruiting even more people to be super sophons would be challenging, I think.
The more I look at these 4 scenarios, the mitigation for scenario 1, sophons getting excessive power and acting bad, if they piss off the community enough, the community's going to fork.
Vote them out?
Or just ditch the protocol, say, fine, we're going to go redeploy it elsewhere without you guys, and just completely abandon the infrastructure altogether.
I agree with Dietz. It would be more likely that sophons would just be removed.
Yeah, there's a whole offboarding.
But I see what you're saying of in that situation where trust has eroded completely to the point where, community and I as I said yesterday, I'm trying to get myself to move away from that term, but the contributorship especially loses trust. I can see that happening.
Yeah.
I mean, just like everybody here, I would consider a contributor. But the kind of core contributors, especially if those folks lose trust, I mean, that's where things either die in the water or they find greener pastures.
Does the community have the capability to declare a vote of no confidence for a sophon?
Yes. Well, yeah, right now it's not very well defined, but that's one of the first things we're hoping to get out to the community in terms of proposals. We're still workshopping that internally, but they absolutely are going to.
Yeah, then the more I look at these different scenario possibilities, the more that sophons decide makes sense. There's already checks and balances on them.
Yep.
There is ways to remove them when they begin bad acting, and that naturally creates a check on their power because they can be removed from power. And so I look at that and see the breaking things, and there's a lot of things that are mitigating.
My thought would be, who would want to be a regular sophon if there's a super sophon above you that
right. Who does less
that it's less work and you have all the deciding power. So, I would see that as a challenge of people not wanting to, since my guess would be that you can't hold both positions, that quality candidates would think, well, I'm going to reserve myself for super sophons. If I don't get that, then I'm either a sophon or I don't care anymore.
Yep.
So I think the argument against that point of view, though, is that I think sophons should be paid and super sophons should definitely not be paid, right? So it's this extra role that somebody who in the community probably doing something else for this kind of special case circumstance, because ultimately if there's not real reasons to believe whether somebody's trustable or not, you never know until you live it. But if there's not real reasons for people to believe that super sophons are super trustable, then they just shouldn't exist. And if they're super trustable, considering that there's almost nothing for them to do most of the time, and I actually do think that would be a vast majority of the time, then really it's just this emergency role for the really rare use case.
Mm-hmm.
And if those are trustable people and they're not being compensated for this extra role, then there's no reason to like prefer being super Sofan over Sofan. It's like, you know, whoever's doing that should just be people that enough people in the community believe is somebody that understands the community and they trust, and because they're almost never doing anything,
Mm-hmm.
right, their motivation should simply be intrinsic, because this is for the best interest of the community, and therefore you don't have this competition between Sofans and super Sofans at all.
Yeah.
There could potentially be a tragedy of the commons situation, though, where the incentive to be a super Sofan being removed in such a way, you have a potential downside to being a super Sofan, but no upside. And that means that the position remains unfilled because people who are offered up as nominations for the process say, I don't want it.
I believe that in theory, if the community is interesting at all, I would like to believe that there are enough people who are a part of it with actual intrinsic motivation that would be unlikely.
What do you think the ratio of overlap would be of having that intrinsic motivation?
Yeah, well, that gets into what Dietz was saying about, defining who can be super Sofans gets interesting and hard, and I think would take time. But I also think that you probably have the time before you get to the situation where you really need it, right? I mean, what's being defined, I think it's a good exercise because we're thinking about some really important stuff. But my belief is the immunity is running well. Like, it's much less than 1% of the time you're going to see this kind of situation.
Yes. This should be extremely rare. But you never know.
Supreme Court case kind of stuff, which leads me to wonder, does that open a potential vector of long-term governance attack through precedent setting?
In what way?
Well, the same way that if a Supreme Court ruling in the States says one thing, that the rest of the courts take that almost as law, even if it wasn't established as a voted law of the land. So they become a governing body through their rulings.
Yeah, I think the analogy is kind of broken though, in that the Supreme Court is literally way more active than super Sofans ever would be.
Yeah. They wouldn't be. Well, let's push that further. Like so our KIPs end up being sort of our statutory rule system, right? And so then if
That's how I interpret it.
yeah, so if this body is making decisions outside of that, then yeah, I mean it's worth thinking about. I feel like we'd be in real trouble if this got called sufficiently frequently to end up creating any kinds of precedents. But it's a good I need to put that down.
If the super Sofans are more or less constitutionally constrained in the way that they can make their ruling via KIP documentation, I think that does an awful lot to create protocol alignment long term so that you can still maintain that check on the community.
Yeah, just thinking about that. So what do you mean as a check on the community?
Well, in many of these choices, token holders decide and things like that, the community winds up being the end arbiter state, which if the community is opposed to the protocol, you get that deleterious proposal brought through because the community is misaligned to the protocol's survival.
Gotcha.
By creating the constraints of a constitutional method, you close off that level of community interaction.
Yep. Just trying to think of how to phrase that. Yeah. Okay. Well, this was. I'm happy to keep talking about this. I know we're over the hour, so I just wanted to acknowledge that. But yeah, you know what, Joe? I'm sorry. I'm not understanding your point, and I want to be sure I understand it.
If the super sophons are constrained in their decision-making capability when presented with a decision beforehand via constitutional type methods,
Okay.
then it is possible to ensure alignment to the protocol framework in their decision-making structure, which is the chief concern of them acting in favor of the community rather than the protocol.
I see what you mean.
As I understand it.
Yep.
In this example, isn't that decision simply, to let it pass or not pass? I mean,
Yeah. Yep. It's limited to a proposal.
so that's another place where it's kind of really different from the Supreme Court. There's no way to set precedents if this is the type of solution that's always being solved. It's just the elected agency elders getting to say whether something should go through or not.
Yeah. Anything else? I don't want to close before everyone's had a chance to speak. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. What do you want to talk about in 2 weeks? I have some ideas, but I would love to know what a couple things have come up here in terms of the SOFONs, and that's something we're definitely focusing on. But are there any things we should carry forward into our next workshop?
I mean, from my perspective, the concept of trust comes up a lot, which I think would be a solid segue into onboarding, offboarding of SOFONs. Because if we want to talk about establishing trust and what we'd want to see from our what I would consider trusted delegated power party, I think that'd be an interesting place to go from here.
Okay.
That's just my humble opinion.
Welcome opinion. All right. Well, we have 2 weeks, so plenty of time. I may poll people again before then. But in the meantime, anything else before we close? All right, great. Well, thank you, everybody, for taking the time on at least what is here, a summer afternoon, late in the day. If you haven't voted, please do. And other than that, have a great afternoon and evening.
Thanks, Jason.
All right, thank you.